What we're going to build here is a precursor to a more advanced setup, but it's going to use some of the underlying principles that we've discussed in the first part of this tutorial. So let's get cracking and drop down a GeoSop. Resize this a bit so I can work better. Dive into the GeoSop, and again, if you don't have the inside of that node perfectly centered, space and age just centers the stops. Okay, let's delete that and start with a platonic. Because I want to have something with edges this time. Gonna do a VDB from polygons to convert it into a VDB. Wire that up here, highlight it, and that's a bit too coarse for my liking, so I'll dial the voxel size down to something like that. Okay, what I want to do is I would like to advect this VDB, so that means I would like to move it in the directions of the volume's gradient, so in the direction of the vectors pointing to the surface. I'm going to do that with a VDB advect SDF node, which I will hook up here. So this is the VDB that it's going to advect. And what it's missing now, and when I middle click on the node, I can see what it's complaining about. In this case, it's not in a source specified. So I can hover over this input here, middle click again, it shows me it expects a velocity VDB. So basically that's a VDB with the volumes it should advect towards. So let's give it the gradient of that volume. I can calculate the gradient of that volume with a VDB analysis node. And as soon as I wire that up and highlight it, this gives me several options what to calculate from the VDB. In our case, we're just going to go with the gradient, but let's keep in mind there are other things that we can use this node for to calculate. So let's try out what happens when I wire that up and highlight it. So again, disable it, enable it. So that's just kind of bloating it outwards. And the reason why that is pretty much plain to see, because what I'm calculating here is just the vectors pointing towards this surface here. And when I feed that into the advect node, what it's going to do is it looks up on each point of the surface where the vector is pointing, which is pretty much pointing in the direction of the surface. So kind of like the surface normal when you think about polygon mesh, only for a volume. So at this moment, all this node does is just move the surface along its normal direction. Something like this. But I'd like to do a bit more complicated thing, and the thing I'd like to do is I would like to advect the surface, so to move the surface farther away at the areas where there are edges. So how can I find out where are edges in my volume? Again, the VDB analysis node is very helpful for that, as it gives me the possibility to calculate a curvature. And the curvature becomes bigger where where there is stronger bends in the volume. So it'll become more on these like edges and less on these plain flat surfaces here on the side. Okay, so in order to take that into account for our advection strength, what I have to do now is take these vectors here, which again are the gradient, in our case comparable to the surface normals if that were a polygon, and multiply this gradient vectors with the curvature as a scalar, so just as a multiplication factor. And I'm going to do that inside a volume blob. So just for keeping the setup kind of clean, the thing I'd like to do is give this analysis node, the output of it, a custom name. So in our case, I'd like to call that grad for gradient. And in this case, I am going to call it curve for curvature. So feed in the gradient here, curvature goes into the second slot, highlight it, dive into that. We don't have density. The only thing we have at this moment is a thing called gradient, so what I can safely do is delete that here and bind the gradient, so basically import the gradient vector, and I'm going to do that with a node called bind. Set it to vector here, as we want to import a gradient, which is a vector, and the gradient is called grad. So that imports the gradient. Second thing I'd like to do is, from this second input node, for each position in my volume which stores the gradient, I would like to look up the value of the curvature. I'm going to do that with a volume sample node. What this does is it takes the second input, the one where we hooked up the curvature, and looks up the value of that volume on the position we tell it to, and in our case, just wire the position of the current voxel into there. So for each voxel we're operating on, we look up the current curvature. Okay. Now, just to have a bit of a possibility to influence our setup, what I'd like to add here is a ramp parameter node, which allows me to remap the curvature values, so to influence their effectiveness on the whole setup. Okay, all I have to do now is multiply this remap value with gradient and output that again. So I'll add a multiply node, wire up the gradient in here, and let's move that up here, and wire up the output of the remapped curvature in here, and I'm going to export it to my volume with a bind export node. And again, I can override the parameter then after I've done all these calculation steps, so I'll output it as grad again, and it's going to be a vector, hopefully, and we just wire that up here. So that is it. Again, what I'm doing here is, on the one hand, import the gradient, the vector. Then, on the same position that I imported the vector from, I'm going to look up the curvature value, which comes from the second volume here. I'm going to remap that curvature value, so just that I have some influence on it, and multiply the gradient vector with the curvature. And the curvature in this case is a scalar for the vector. And after that multiplication is done, I'm going to output that. And again, call it gradient. Okay. So let's wire up this. Not too much happening here, but let's just take this, add a null, just so that we have one common input, and take this construct here, copy it and put it into a solver. Wire up our volume into the solver, dive inside the solver, and paste this construct here, and wire that up to the input here. Okay, highlight the VDB Advect as an output, go outside of the solver, highlight it, and let's hit play. And it's pretty much doing nothing. Not exactly what I expected. So, let me just check. Oh, I think I found it. Okay, the thing is, inside the VDB Advect, I need to tell it the name of the velocity volume. And I didn't do that. And my velocity volume is called grad from this here, because in here I just load the grad and export to the grad again. So I'll have to tell my VDB Advect node the name of that vector field, and it is called grad, and the parameter is name. So attribute name equals grad. That should fix it. Let's see. Not much here. Think I found it. I mean, it was remapping from 0 to 0, so everything was multiplied by 0. So let's just dial that up. And we see something happening. Perfect. So when we dive outside, hit play, it's doing this weird thing. So some errors in here that yield this weird, very organic looking results. But the thing I'd like to focus on is in the first frame we can see around the edges here that it's really advecting outwards a bit more than on the plane inside here. However, it yields those weird errors there, and there are several ways how I can reduce those artifacts here. I mean, if you want to keep them, nice. But for a certain setup, I needed those artifacts to be gone. And I discovered several things. On the one hand, this path here, which basically just calculates the vector field, which tells the VDB advect in which direction the volume should be advected, works a bit better when I feed it into the VDB advect node with half of its original resolution. And the way I'm going to do that is with a VDB resample node, which is going to go in here and in between those. And I will tell that node to resample the vector field, so the volume, and I would like it to be scaled using the voxel scale. And the voxel size should be twice the original size, so the resolution halves. Okay. So as you can see, this slightly blurred out the errors, but when we go up, hit simulate again, we still see some weird things happening here. And the way we're able to fix that a bit better is by going in here and adding a VDB smooth in between here, so that smooths out the vector values. Hit play again. That looks better, but still not perfect. So what I can do as well is, after the advection step, I'm going to add another VDB smooth, this time a smooth SDF, so it smooths out the surface. Fire that up here, highlight it, and let's maybe do only 2 iterations, as well as here do only 2 iterations, and that should be suffice. Okay, let's hit play. I'm liking that a bit better. I mean, I can live with those artifacts, because what they actually do is they make it look a bit organic. So what this thing will actually do once we let it simulate is it will yield a look which is a bit similar to human tissue. That is, on the one hand you could compare it to a human brain, on the other hand you could compare it to other organs, which I don't want to elaborate any further. But yeah, so this is the basic setup. So this is the structure it yields. Okay, what we did again was we created a geometry, turned that into a volume, and then inside the solver, we did this with it. We split the streams into 2 parts. The one part goes straight to the VDB advect SDF, because that's the input geometry that should be advected. And in this part here, we're calculating a vector field for the VDB advect SDF node to tell it in which direction to advect the geometry. We do that by first resampling the input geometry, basically to smoothen out values. Then attaching 2 VDB analysis node. On the one hand, the first VDB analysis node gives me the gradient field from the geometry, so basically the geometry's normals in a volume. Second node gives me the curvature. So this node is a higher value where the geometry has corners. We feed that into a volume bob, and what we basically do inside is we multiply both vector fields with each other and remap the curvature value so that we can influence the look of the simulation. After that, we still smooth out the vector field even further, so we get rid of weird artifacts and feed that into the VDB advect SDF node, which is responsible for pushing the volume surface around. And after that is done, we blur it out slightly again to get rid of some artifacts we introduced. Yeah, that was the basic setup for VDB advection. And this is just the precursor for another very interesting setup, which we're going to dive into in part 3. So, see you soon.